And, I will introduce Heather now. So, as I mentioned in the invitation, let me just get rid of these menu thingies. Heather went to the trouble of getting trained in both educational and clinical psychology, which is an achievement. And why did you do that, Heather?
Why? Because I wanted to do therapy, and you couldn't when I was an ed psych at the time.
Yeah, that makes
now.
sense.
Anyway, better in some respects.
Heather is part of the Coventry Constructivist Centre, which puts on courses and study days. Something that you should all think about joining. You're writing, overall, I'm trying to bring more people into learning about PCP. Mostly I'm engaged in producing things that are free and low cost with the intention of increasing accessibility. And you've made a podcast called Drawing the Ideal Self. That's the sort of overall title, isn't it?
Yeah, it's only called that because that was the name of my technique.
Yeah. But you're getting lists. So far, you've had 2,376 plays across 17 episodes. People do go back to listen to previous episodes, so they're able to find more PCP immediately. The audience is mostly in the UK at the moment, 81%. 77% are female, 56% aged between 18 and 34, and only 1% over 60. That's good news for the future of PCP, I think.
Very.
This week, it was listed 14 in a list of the top 25 psychology podcasts.
Oh, well done. I have no idea how that happened. It's nothing to do with me.
You will find in your chat, I understand I might need to put it in again, because if you hadn't joined when I put it in, you can't see it. So I'll put that link in a minute. I started the podcast when someone asked me if there were any audio books for PCP, and I could find none. The aim is to help people to get into PCP and to learn more, hopefully whetting their appetite for further study. I'm also trying to showcase a range of practitioners and professions of PCP to encourage people to see how they can use it in their own work. With no further ado, Heather, let me hand over to you.
Okay, thank you. I'll see if I can share my screen.
I'll just put that link in. Where was it?
Oh, host disabled participant screen sharing.
No problem. I'll fix it.
We're all learning new language with these things, aren't we? Honestly,
yeah,
who'd have thought we'd have to talk like this?
Should be okay now, Heather.
Okay.
There's some instructions that I've put in there too, which will be relevant in a minute later on, I guess.
Okay, can you see that?
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
Hey, good. All right then. And I've found that if I click play, it works less well than if I click through the slides. And rather than waste time fiddling around and seeing if I can make it work, I'm going to go for it like this. So is it? I mean, that's probably big enough. Is that big enough?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great.
Is it big enough for people with phones? Can you see all right? If you're looking on a little phone, anyone doing that?
Yeah, it is fine. It is fine.
Okay,
great.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so the plan, I've allowed a bit of slippage because my experience with these things is some bits take longer than you expect, and often they're the discussion parts, and we don't want to stop that happening. So I haven't filled every second, which is a first for me. I'm learning from my mistakes. So we're going to think about using a drawing technique, and you're going to have a go at it later. And I'm going to show you a case example of a girl that I worked with where this arose, really. So what tends to happen with me is I'll be working with somebody, I hit a problem, I think I can't use something I've used before, I need something else. And I make something that fits with that moment. And that's what happened with this girl, actually. And when I talked about it in Belgrade, doing some training. They said, what's it called? And I hadn't got a name for it. So I said, oh, I'll call it the Belgrade technique. So it's called that. And that's why. It's not because it's got anything else to do with Belgrade, except that that was when it was named. But you can get it on my website if you want the proper details. And I'm very, very keen on using drawing. I use drawing in my own self-care. You know, when I'm working through a problem, I will use drawing stuff. So I'll use some of the techniques that I've developed and I'll use other people's stuff, but it's a very loosening sort of experience for me. Now, I know that isn't the case for some people who have a lot of anxiety around drawing, in the sense of it takes them back to somewhere they don't really want to go. They could use that experience today. But I find that actually, once you can get over the idea of it's okay to draw sort of concepts and sketches, you don't have to draw works of art. And in fact, most of the things that I do, I really don't want works of art. I had a girl who spent half an hour colouring in shoes. And from that day, I never used coloured pens again because that wasn't the task. It didn't matter what colour she did. So there is some interesting research, and I've put these in a list. So if you're watching on a recording, you can always pause it if you want to see some references that you could go and look at about whether drawing is a valid way to do an exploration, really. And I quite like this quote, you know, that it's really about offering rich and insightful method. So it can add something extra. But there's some concerns about that because, you know, perhaps people like doing drawing things, but they don't really tell you more than you could have got in a conversation. Or you haven't thought about how the fact of drawing might actually affect what comes out in terms of the data. So those are two things to bear in mind. And to bear in mind, I am extremely biased. That's just too bad for today. So, you know, Kelly drew our attention to the fact that some things are not going to be able to be said. You know, that we will have constructs that we don't really have the words for. And they may be able to be shown in drawing in a way that you couldn't do in language, which I think is interesting. And I love this quote from Tom Ravenette, you know, that language is a medium through which constructions are communicated. It is therefore a bridge, but language also comes between the experiencing of events and its communication, and it may therefore be a barrier to the communication of that experience. And I find that there are people that I try to work with who really struggle to express themselves with words. And I've worked a lot with children and adults with autism. And that's a particular group who have their own kind of idiosyncratic ways of talking that are more difficult, or there'll be some things they just don't maybe yet have the language for. And it's very apparent when you're working with young children, but it's not actually to do with age. So I've worked using very much a verbal therapy with a 5-year-old, extremely articulate, to sort out her dog phobia. It worked like a dream. And she talked the hind leg off a donkey. She could talk really well, extremely able. I've worked with 17-year-olds and 45-year-olds who really couldn't do it at that level at all. So, you know, we need some alternatives for people who find just the words very difficult. That's the list in case you want it. So already, sorry, I'm going to ask you to pause it because this is case material that I have the permission to share, but not for the recording. Because it happened before recording came in. Okay. So what I'm going to show you is some work that I'd be interested to see what you think of that. If you think back to that thing right at the beginning, here, there was some concern about is doing something with drawing always better than talking? And you've got to think about how it might shape the results, if you like. What do you think about that for her?
Well, it was obviously an absolutely perfect way for her to tell somebody for the first time absolutely crucial experiences.
Mm.
And it supported all her executive function and her language needs, because you were breaking it up and it was sequential. And the fact that you could allow her to put extra bits into the sequence as they were recalled meant that they weren't seen as fabulations. They were just seen as additional memory. And you were working with that whole memory process of one part of the construct sparking the memory of the next part of the construct. So it worked very effectively in terms of both her executive function and her language.
I hadn't thought of it like that, yeah.
Threatening way of doing it as well.
Pardon?
And the non-threatening way, the kind of non-threatening co-construction.
And certainly, she didn't show any stress. You know, she sometimes was sad about things, but you know, she was able to go through the process and be okay with it. In some ways, more matter-of-factly than I received it, because she was used to this life that I wasn't. Yeah. And I think in terms of her, you know, I could have done something different with her. I could have used a different technique. I could have not used anything. I could have, you know, tried to do only talking. And I think only talking would not have been as good for her, because I've got to get over this needing to please me, but also having something to tell. And I don't think she had the words to tell. Her drawings are actually very expressive, aren't they?
Yeah. I think, I mean, one of the things for me about drawings is that they endure in time. You know, conversations are lost, you know, I mean, you can remember them, but not very well.
Yes.
The drawing there, it's something that I used to use a lot to bring it back to the next session, and it would just bring the conversation of the previous session alive.
Yes, I find that too, that it's once you've got a drawing, you know, something like that, it's very easy to remember it and to remember what was going on with it. And I think, you know, even though if you looked at, you know, what age those drawings are from, you know, what intellectual age somebody is at, that's going to be very young in terms of the way she's drawn bodies, yet she's able to express herself really well.
Exactly.
And also, Heather, children with severe literacy problems very often equate drawing with literacy. And the fact that you were enabling her to be literate in her own code would have reinforced her beliefs about herself as actually clever rather than totally useless, which would have made a huge impression on her.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. And she was literate enough to tell the story, wasn't she?
Yeah, she can tell stories. The fact that you can't write it down doesn't matter. She could encode, and she could express it in a meaningful way to another person.
Yeah.
Heather, did you see Rachel's comment there about?
No, sorry, I can't see any of the chat.
Oh, Rachel, would you like to unmute and?
Yeah, I was just saying, it's interesting in some of the little people, the arms are missing, and some of them they're not fully formed.
Yeah.
And again, what that says about her, and you know, and also the feet and the legs, about her own sort of sensory experience of being held and being hugged, and of where she fits in the world.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's in her drawings are consistent, aren't they?
Yeah.
There's style. She has a style.
Yeah, the faces are much more animated, aren't they? There's particularly the mouths.
Yeah. Yeah. But there's a lot of smiling at times you wouldn't smile. like that. And I found that with kids, drawing traumatic things, that sometimes you get smiles, but actually when people are terrified, their mouths do go a bit weird, don't they? It might not be a smile, it might be a look of horror, but could be interpreted as a smile, or it could be that she just drew it because that's how you draw people. You draw smiles. That's one of the things you learn. But this one, with the crying, when she's woken, it was very expressive.
I have a comment, maybe not so much about this particular case, but about the idea that you started with, the asking that what do you think of drawing as a medium as opposed to language? Might there be problems with it? Might it distort or what have you? And it strikes me that that question is only kind of meaningful if you think that there's a correct way to represent experience. That language in some way is some veridical representation of experience, and that's the standard. Well, of course, language, quote unquote, distorts just as much as any other representation does. And so it seems to me that these are simply different modes of representation. So that, if we look at 15 there with that mouth, the way it's, the mouth is clearly accentuated. You can't accentuate a mouth when you say she smiled.
Yeah.
So there's something very different going on here than in language, and it seems to me that neither is primary.
Yeah.
Both are very informative.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. I remember Tom Ravenette saying, the drawing tells you something else. So you've got two sources of data, not just the words. And I think that was the case for her. She was able to say more than she could in words.
Note, if I can, because since you mentioned the Ravenette, because that's what I was thinking of. If the Ravenette quote, if I recall it, it does seem to me that he was separating the meaning and the experience on one hand from the representation, the linguistic or a pictorial representation on the other, suggesting that somehow the language represented something that was already there in some sense, and so that the language was simply some type of a vehicle. I would argue that the language is part of the process of the meaning, and so are the pictures. They're not separate; they inform each other.
Yeah, and I was thinking as well about Kelly's stuff about postures, and in the drawings that she did, you get a sense. Where's the one where she goes to the police station? A sense of her size, is there. She's a little thing in that police station. I mean, if only they hadn't taken her to the police station, then that might not have cemented the view of the family of she's the bad guy. And when I met this girl, her sister was still having skin grafts as a result of the burn. So the burning had been extensive. You get a sense of a small person, this little thing in the car, which is represented very nicely, I think, in the way that she's done that, and of her being on her own, and where people are in relation to each other is interesting too. And I think that you wouldn't necessarily get that if you were only talking. You'd miss that information, wouldn't you? Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do is to have a go at a version of that. Obviously, we don't have as long, and you haven't necessarily got time to do lots of pieces of paper and things like that and then stick them on something. Because what I would do is have them in the ripped up pieces of paper and then glue them together to make the story at the end, once we know what order they go in. So what I'm going to do is ask you to go into pairs and then thinking about an experience that you can remember, preferably not as traumatic as anything like this, but something that had an effect on you, so that you learnt something about yourself as a result of that experience, and see if you can draw a comic strip. So, you know, you might have 6 pictures, you might have 8 pictures, you might have 10 pictures, whatever. So you spend a bit of time doing your comic strip, and then think about, okay, what are the 1 or 2 most important parts in terms of your understanding of something important about yourself, or how other people construed you, and think about what that was, and then think, what was it about those things? You know, what was said or understood, and what was not said or understood or hidden deliberately. You know, it could be that, you know, there were things that were not to be mentioned again. When I was a kid, I went to a shop and some kids got me to steal something, some big boys, and put it under my coat. And my dad found out, because he went in the shop after me and came chasing me on the way to school and stopped me. I had no idea really, because I was about 6, how bad that was. The boys knew, and I never got to keep the thing anyway. It was chocolate. And so I just handed it over to them and went to school as if this was a normal activity. And we never talked about it after that day. My dad told me, you can't do that. He never later on said, you can't do it. It was like, it's never to be mentioned, because it's such a terrible thing to have done. So that, you know, there was something I learnt about my parents' tolerance of my mistakes, maybe, from that experience. So thinking about, you know, how the experience that you've chosen and the bits that you've picked out affected your sense of self, and then have a discussion with your partner. So what I'm going to ask us to do is to go into pairs from the beginning, because otherwise it's complicated to get you back at the right time. And if you can spend the sort of 15 minutes on your own, if it takes you less time, that's okay. But don't have the discussion until you're both ready. That's okay. Is that all right? That makes sense. The instructions are in the chat, I think. Are they in, Harry?
Should be. Can
Okay.
everyone see that?
Could I just ask you, could you do the breakout rooms? My Zoom keeps dropping out.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. And we'll come back and talk about what you've, we don't need the detail of what you've done, but you know, what you've made of it to be interesting to discuss later.
So we'll
Okay.
pause the recording until we come back for the
Yeah.
last discussion.
We are now recording again. And so Heather.
Okay, so what I'd be interested to know is how you found that as a, I suppose, as an experience of doing.
We were saying, Heather, that it was nice to be able to start anywhere, whereas with language you have to form the whole idea first before you can start. You can start a drawing anywhere.
Yeah. And did that help you to put the story together?
Yeah, because I started in the middle, and then even after we discussed it, I realised I'd missed out kind of a crucial, the most important bit of it.
That's interesting. Yeah. But you can go back and put it in. Yeah.
I think one of the things I like about using drawings, and I think I definitely felt it whilst I was doing this, is that the drawer is in control. The person's story is in control. I don't want to. I was going to use the word power, and I thought I don't think I really mean that, but I think we donate a lot of words when we're with people. We fill in the silences, don't we, and things like that. And I think with children, I think there's almost, they sit and wait. If they wait long enough, you know, the adult will just take over in some way.
Yeah. And was it easier to do it like that, to have the control, than if somebody had, say, interviewed you about it?
Yeah, I think there's a danger when if you rely on words is if a child's trying to explain, if I was a child and I'd been explaining my drawings, I could imagine an adult going, oh, well, do you mean that? Or do you mean that? Or do you think that they maybe thought they would try and fill in at a point where my head's not, I'm not at that point. I'm at this point and I'm just trying to tell you about these events and that's what you asked me to do. And now you're trying to make excuses for it, or you're trying to give it an interpretation that I'm not sure I'm on board with that interpretation. Whereas whilst I've got this, it's mine. And hopefully that person's job then is that it's their responsibility just to sort of ask and go on the journey with the child.
So something about getting through the whole story before you discuss it, do you think?
Possibly. I mean, I know kids who they want to tell you what they're doing on the way.
Yeah.
And just sort of, you're sort of going, you might make, okay, all right, okay, yeah, oh, I see. You might make those sorts of noises. Sometimes I have said to kids, let me know when you've finished. Let me know when it's okay for me to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Occasionally I've had a child who wants me to do the drawing, but that's always a bit iffy, but interesting version of events.
Yeah. And I guess, if somebody wanted you to draw for them, provided they could tell you what to draw, you could draw something, but it wouldn't be there. You'd be so open to getting it wrong, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah, invariably I do it bad enough that eventually they go, oh, I'll just draw it.
I have had children ask me to draw because they haven't dared to put it on paper, because once it's on paper it's real, but they've really needed to put it somewhere that's not inside them. And then I've been asked to draw. But again, my drawing skills are, I can draw rebus symbols and that's it. So they will take over. But it's almost like there's a point where it's safe if somebody else puts it on paper for you.
Maybe, yeah, that makes sense.
Did you ask us to draw a situation from childhood and adolescence because this is a technique that's primarily used with children? Or because you think as adults?
Yeah, it's just a thing to do, and you could use it with anybody. So you could draw, I would do it for any age, depending on something we were exploring. So, I did mine. I didn't find it difficult to draw it at all. I'm not good at drawing though, provided you can get over that. But, the experience of the doing of it, I think, well, tell me what other people think. Do you think it's a thing for kids, or could anybody use it?
Can I say something?
It's a question of whether with an adult you would always to draw a childhood experience, or
I see, whether you would ask an adult to draw a childhood experience. I might, depends, I suppose.
You think? Do you want to?
Yeah. You can call me Alex. While I was trying to draw the events, I'm having some more very clear picture of what happened at that moment. And it's a little bit struggle for me I was struggling to try to redraw the whole picture, which I want to put as much detail as I want, which results that I couldn't do that, making the drawing process quite struggle for me.
Okay. Because you wanted to put more detail in it.
Yeah, because I'm having this picture in my head and I want to put every details at that moment to try to put into the drawing.
Yeah. I mean, you could take longer. You only had a very short time to draw.
That's true.
That was a pressure that you wouldn't have to have if you were doing it, if you were using it in therapy, you would have a longer period. And certainly, my experience of using drawing things with people is some people are very quick and some people take ages. And you never know which one they're going to be.
I wondered whether you might link it with, because sometimes I ask people to draw their problem, and I'm just wondering whether you could draw, you could incorporate this into saying, you know, this is my problem, and what was life before like, and what might it be like if that problem went away. So in a way,
Yes.
the problem could be in the middle of the story, possibly.
Yeah.
Then you could move sort of either way from that.
Yeah.
Often we would say, well, is there a way of getting out of this problem? How could you solve this problem? Is there anything that could change that would help you to solve this problem? So it might be quite interesting just to try that. How elaborate things are beforehand, and if there's any imagination about how things could be if the problem was less of a problem.
I've done that kind of thing and said, can you draw a toolbox to help you solve the problem, or at least try and solve the problem? And then what's in the toolbox? And you know, that can be anything.
Yeah.
I use classrooms a lot. I ask kids to draw, can you draw what your classroom is like for you? And then see where that goes. And then often that leads to, can you draw what you would like a classroom to be like?
And I guess there's quite a contrast sometimes.
Yeah, I had a brilliant one once where a kid drew three classrooms, and in each one increasingly, there was one where the child had his head on the table, the next one the child had little Z's, and the next one the child was just flat out on the floor. And I was like, oh gosh, what's going on there? And he said, oh, this one the child's just bored. The next one he said, yeah, he's still bored here. And then the one where he was flat out, the kid said, he's so bored, he's bored to death. I was like, okay, no clues then for going on what's going on in the classroom.
One of your colleagues years ago did a Lego classroom, didn't they, Heather?
Yes, Jane Williams did. No, sorry, that was Faye, wasn't it? Yeah, so the idea of that is you get somebody to make out of Lego their ideal classroom. And then get them to do a tour. And I've done a version of it with my son with Minecraft. So in Minecraft, you can make anything. So that's in the free book that you can get on my website. You can see it as the final thing. And there's a little video of him taking us around his ideal school in Minecraft land. And then, you know, ends up with, okay, so if that's the ideal school, have you got a message for the governors, the chair of governors, about how you'd like school to be? And it was quite a fun thing to do with him. Cost me £5, that did. That's the fee that I'm charged by my children. They're examples.
I think the one thing about getting adults to do this, there's more resistance to drawing, you know, and you'll get that, oh, but I can't draw. They feel very self-conscious. That if you can get over that, I think it absolutely could use with adults. And
I find children easier to get to draw because they are used to being asked to draw at school, aren't they? You know, they will have a lesson that involves them having to draw. And also they're now being taught in terms of the national curriculum in the UK that what a sketch is. So they understand a sketch is a very quick drawing, and it doesn't have to be precise or especially good. It's just getting your ideas down, and that's helpful, I think. But obviously the older generations haven't had any of that, and they'll have had lots of instructions about not being able to draw, probably.
What about that term
you either can or can't. Pardon?
What about that term sketch? That might be a way to get adults to feel more comfortable.
Just a quick, or even sort of matchstick, even suggest matchstick, although you don't want to be too prescriptive either. But you know, matchstick is not so threatening.
Yes.
I think with adults, it might be a particularly good way of getting in touch with old childhood experiences. Because it's, I know I used to draw a lot as a child, and doing this, I was surprised at the situation that I chose, which I think is particularly pertinent to my life now, thinking about it, although I didn't choose it for that reason. But doing the drawing, I think, put me right back there into those childhood experiences, probably more so than talking about it would.
I wonder if there's something about using using a method that you would have been using at the time, kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Mm.
It could also be used as a sort of self-characterization, couldn't it? You know, the way they do say with self-character, you could use a sketch for a self-characterization sometimes.
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah.
That triggered me because recently I tried to talk with one client and suggested to do the self-characterization. It never happened. He couldn't have done it. For him, that was a very difficult task, but when I asked him to do it in a way, in a drawing, it just happened very, very, very fast. Yeah. So tidying the meanings, because he couldn't grasp like what would he like to type and put into the word, and then drawing enabled, as one of us today said, like you could put more details and still have them at the same time coming to you as an information. You don't do it successively like you do with the words. You have it all at once.
Yeah.
So you don't have this what was written first and what was written last. You just have everything, all the details coming at you at once.
Yeah.
Do you think drawing gets, when you're drawing something that's happened before, do you think it's, in a sense, it recalls the entire embodied experience, and you're putting quite a lot of that embodied experience down on paper in terms of the form of the body or the form of the interactions, so that when you're putting it on paper, you're not actually necessarily just choosing the things you've encoded in words, but you're actually able to depict the things that you've experienced as a full embodied construct.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot to that. You know, when I was doing my comic and asking the girl out for the date, I on the playground, I drew a building that I did not anticipate that I was going to build, that I was going to draw, and the building, we were hiding behind the building, which was separating me from all the other kids who could have been. I had no idea that was even there, but the act of drawing, brought back the entire relational ecology of the thing.
Yeah. I had a sense that I drew my pictures, and then I thought, oh yeah, and it was sunny, and in lots of ways that was irrelevant to what the story was about, but it was important to get it in there because later on it was night, and I had to have that relationship in there somehow. So it was when I looked at the picture, I was thinking, what was the day like? I was there, I could remember being there and being warm, and yet if you'd have said to me, what was the weather like on that day, and asked me to say it in words, I don't think I would have had any idea. Not quickly enough to be able to put it down.
Yeah, probably it gives
Visceral.
more space to elements that you wouldn't, first things first, put into words. They're just, they're there, you construe them, they are parts of your experience, but they're not used so ready-made, and they're not as important in their form of the words rather than in visual representation or even something else.
I also think for me, it was drawing them actually got me to absorb myself in the experience in lots of ways. Whereas if I was verbally telling the story, I know, because I'm me, I'd be much more interested in what the other person was making of what I was saying. So actually drawing, cut out the middleman for a little while, allowed me to just be absorbed in the drawing and then come back to Rachel and explain what that was about. Whereas if I wouldn't have engaged, or I wouldn't have connected with the affect quite as much if I was just telling it.
Okay, that's interesting, isn't it? And that goes back absolutely to Kelly, and that we're construing all of the time, and sometimes we're more conscious and aware of our construing, and sometimes we're not. And he liked the term conscious, unconscious, but that's the lay person's term, isn't it?
Yeah, an overactive sociality gland, really.
It's rather a nice philosophical construct that Husserl talks about, which is signative versus fulfilled. So signative is a word that actually, when you hear the word, it remains abstract. So if there's an example in the literature where somebody uses the example of saying to somebody, there's a police car in the drive, looking out the window, there's a police car in the drive. And when you hear the sentence, there's a police car in the drive, it's still conceptual. It's just, it could be, you know, it could be any car, any police, but when you see it out of the window, there, he says it's like the concept is fulfilled with content. I think that's quite relevant in a way.
Yeah,
To
yeah,
the discussion about the difference between language and drawing.
yes,
Or it can be used to throw some light on that.
yeah.
When Rachel talks about you're absorbed in it, that's a fulfilled thing. It's like constructs, if you like, without any elements except what you sort of vaguely sort of attach. And then when a construct that's full of an actual element or sets of elements fills it up with experience, if you like.
It's making me think, you know, if we don't have a go at offering drawing as an option, that we might be missing some people or some parts they could tell us about that they can't convert into words.
I think it could be a very useful loosening, as we said, loosening technique for people who get a bit stuck or I'm not sure how to express things. And I think it is. Yeah.
Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah. Any other comments or things people want to say?
It's a loosening technique for the person listening as well. I think we can sort of do that thing of, well, where's this story going? What is it that, you know, sort of, where's it going to end? The kind of thing. Whereas with the drawing, you are held in the moment as well as the person watching the picture, the formulation. You sort of know that, you know, there's going to be an endpoint to someone's story, but some people could just ramble on and you kind of like, you know, not got all day sort of thing. You kind of know there's a sheet of paper and it's going to be filled at some point relatively soon.
Katerina, how did you get on with it?
I think it was not a lot of time for us to try it all, unfortunately, because we used to speak quickly, and drawing actually needs sometimes more time and attention. And about technique, it is very nice. It's very interesting for practice, and I like a lot this line between two identities, and also I think the drawing is very nice for social working, because such children, they are speaking a lot with social workers, with policemen, and they used to say the same story. And when we're changing the channel for drawing together, they are telling just different story because it's like another channel. So it's I think very nice. Thank you.
I think that's a really good point, actually, because, you know, for some of the people we see, they've rehearsed their story by the time we see them lots and lots of times, haven't they? They've told lots of people the same construction of their story, and asking them to tell us in a different way might get at some different things.
I thought it would be really useful for supervision as well. I mean, I had a really lovely sort of peer supervision with Rachel, where we reminisced about childhoods in the 70s and what it was like to be in the child world and what the adult world was like. So yeah, it was really nice.
I mean, you could be interesting to use that, just doing that, you know, pick an issue that you've got in supervision that you've got with a client at the moment and draw what that is about, you know, or do the comic strip of, you know, what was going on in the session, what was happening just before, and maybe there'll be other things that you didn't remember until you draw them. I thought it was very interesting when Mike was saying, you know, you'd forgotten, you weren't even thinking that building would be part of it. And I had a similar sort of experience. There were things in there that I wasn't expecting I didn't know they mattered almost.
Mm.
But they
Vero,
are relevant.
did you have your hands similarly?
I was wondering, this reminded me of Machover's draw a person test.
Yeah.
Mm.
And I was thinking, of course, it's not the main point here to decipher how the drawing of a person looks like, but still, how much attention would you dedicate to deciphering, as in, does it have hands? Is it a big or small person? How is the drawing of that person in relation to others, and so on?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that Tom Ravenette said is it's interesting to look at areas that people go over again, you know, and make them darker. That might be something to pick up in the discussion of just to check, is it relevant or not? Does it matter that you've done that? Or, you know, have you put people with no hands because they don't have hands? Or you could ask that. I wouldn't tend to ask that though, because I think I find it interesting to see what people think is relevant to draw. And when I draw my pictures, I miss out so many details about people. You know, I'll draw heads with no ears. I know they have ears, but for the purpose of what we're doing, it doesn't particularly matter.
It's eliciting rather than putting meaning onto it.
Yeah, Jen.
I use your ideal self a lot with adults.
Ah, good.
And I think some of those questions maybe come in more with adults than they might with children. So something like if they've drawn the two characters and one of them has ears and one doesn't, and that there might be a question there. Oh, I notice, you know, the character that you don't like hasn't got ears, and the character that you want to be like does.
Yeah.
And there's potentially something to explore there. Or you know, and quite often I find the style is very relevant with an adult when it can be very striking. One that comes to mind is I was doing some work with somebody who was very, very artistically capable. I mean, they could reproduce anything they wanted to in a very realistic way. But when they did this exercise, the two people they drew were blobs as if produced by a 2-year-old. And this was somebody with a history of abuse that began around about the age of 2. And there was just something about the fact they'd done this exercise in this way when we both knew that their artwork was on a different scale altogether.
Yeah.
There's a complete difference between doing this therapy exercise and doing their art.
That's interesting.
Which is also important information.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
So you might not look at that as much with a child because you don't want to be, well, you don't want to make judgments about where their artistic level may be, but with an adult, it might be relevant.
Yes, yeah. That's a good point.
I wanted to pick up on something I think Anna started to talk about when she talked about the person to whom for whom the pictures are drawn. You know, I always want to lament the penchant for our field to believe that what we're doing with our representations and our measures is to get at something that is objective within the person. You know, we're trying to get some representation of what's really, really there. And so that we worry about interpreting, and interpreting is a problem and that sort of thing. It seems to me that, you know, when you're working with pictures and the language isn't there, it highlights the absolutely important nature of language and co-interpretation, because we're constantly asking, what does that mean? What does that mean? And so when we are creating a picture, it's not an objective representation of what's in us. Self and other are inextricably involved in the in that intersubjective interpretation. It's like the meaning exists between the two of us rather than on the paper or in the statistics or in the language that we report in the paper.
Or
It's
in the
just a
brain.
very different way. Yes, or in the brain, a very different way of thinking about why we do what we do when we measure.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, it can get scary, I think, if you can, if you give too much credibility to the measures.
Oh, there's a measure I like. I wanted to comment on the most scientific measure that that Heather was using, I thought, and that's when she said that the parents were useless. I really liked that. I liked that bold, you know, putting herself in there and really not apologizing for making that that interpretation. I thought that was great.
I just wanted to say also that talking about Tom Ravenette and drawing, we must mention the drawing and its opposite.
Yeah.
Which is such a good technique, because you say to the child, oh, you've made this drawing. Now, you know what it means. I don't know what it means, but you know what it means. Now do another drawing with the opposite meaning. And it just throws it back to the child to create something else out of themselves. It's brilliant.
Yeah.
Just wanted to mention that.
Yes.
We probably need to think about winding up. We've just got a few minutes left. And Jenny, who just spoke a couple of minutes ago, you're doing the next session, aren't you, in 2 weeks' time?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
That's very exciting. I think your title is Exploring Challenges in PCP, a Personal Journey. And I know that you asked people to give some examples of questions about PCP or struggles with it or challenges. How did you actually put the question?
How did I put it? Yeah, I suppose anything that I was interested to hear from anyone who had something that they maybe had read about in PCP but weren't sure what it might look like in practice, or something that just really find it difficult to understand. Anything really. It was quite an open question. So I don't know if some people might notice I have changed the title, and who knows what it'll be on the day, but it will be a mixture of my personal journey and working with some questions that have been sent in to me. And if anybody does have anything that they would like to contribute, then I'm still open to some more questions. I can't promise at this stage to use everything, but I'm certainly happy to try.
May I ask, how can we write you?
I'll put it in the chat. I'll put my
thank you so much.
Chat. I'll do that just now.
Well, just let me thank you again on behalf of us all, Heather, for a most stimulating session.
Thank you very much.